So Kevlar has obviously taken the pickleball world by storm, and with good reason. It's a great material that provides fantastic playability, but which of these Kevlar paddles is actually the best? Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So when I was testing the body Helix paddles a couple of weeks ago, I started thinking, how do these stack up compared to the other Kevlar paddles I've tried? I'd already play tested the Pickleball Apes Pro Line Energy S and the 6-0 Ruby, so I decided I'd try to compare all of them to really get a grasp of which ones performed best in each category. We're going to talk about how they all stack up in power, control, touch, maneuverability, and spin, and at the end of each category, I'll give them a score out of 10. Then, at the end of the video, I'll do a little breakdown of the scores to see if they make sense and analyze what they all mean. Now, of course, before we get into any of that, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about here you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. And please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So let's quickly cover the specs for each. One thing they do all share is that they're all thermoformed, but beyond that, they are certainly not identical. The Pro Line Energy S weighs between 8 and 8.4 ounces. It's 16.4 inches long with a 5.5 inch handle. Pickleball Apes claims it has a classic hybrid shape. It doesn't. It feels more like a standard elongated paddle, and it also has a 16.5 millimeter core with a braided Kevlar and carbon top sheet. Then you've got the X3 paddles, which are 16.5 inches long with very unique 6-inch handles instead of the more standard 5.5. They also have braided Kevlar and carbon top sheets. The weight specs are very different though. The light weighs 8 ounces, whereas the Pro weighs a quite frankly insane 8.8 ounces with one of the highest swing weights I've ever tried. They also have different cores. The Pro's core is 18 millimeters thick, whereas the Light's is only 16, and they also have different technologies going on inside the core. That plays a pretty big role in the playability differences between these two. I do think that X3 core lives up to the Pro name a little bit better. It just feels a little more premium, and we'll discuss that further as we get on with the video. Finally, you've got the Ruby, which weighs 8.2 ounces with a 16 millimeter core, and it's 16.3 inches long. The unique thing about the Ruby is that it has a full Kevlar top sheet, whereas the other ones all had mixed Kevlar with carbon. Now we do have 4 paddles to compare here, so we should really get into some playability characteristics. Without further ado, let's start with spin. In terms of spin, the Ruby consistently stuck out to me as the most impressive in nearly every facet of play. Especially if you're looking to hit slower paced spin shots or for roll volleys at the net, it's significantly better than all the other paddles here because it has such great maneuverability with that hybrid shape. Also, 6-0 has clearly put a ton of R&D into their core and top sheet because this paddle provides a ton of purchase over the ball, and really the only paddle that comes close to the Ruby in any spin category is the Body Helix X3 Pro. In terms of top, and spin, the two are actually very similar, and that's because the X3 Pro also has a very impressive core and top sheet. When I use the term top end spin, I'm talking about the most amount of spin you can produce, and that only comes when you're able to hit a fast full stroke with proper topspin technique. Those shots really only come when you have ample time to set up from the baseline and of course on serve, and for those types of shots I will give the edge to the X3 Pro. It has a little more leverage both in swing weight and overall length, and because its unique shape makes for a swing pattern that complements proper spin technique very well. But of course, you have to remember that those high weight stats are also the major reason for it being worse than the Ruby in slower pace spin. The Pro Line Energy S and the X3 Lite are both noticeably less spin friendly than the other two, but the Energy S did beat out the Lite quite convincingly. It provides a little more grip when you're brushing up. The X3 Lite does feel quite a bit more hollow and less responsive when you're trying to apply topspin technique to the ball. Now I do want to make it clear, even though the X3 Lite is going to come in last, it is still a paddle that's very good for spin. It may not have as impressive a core as its heavier sibling, but it still has the same shape, so it is great for hitting full pace spin shots from the baseline. Ranking them for spin, I have the X3 Lite in last with a score of 7.6, then the Pickleball Apes Pro Line Energy S with a score of 8.2, then the X3 Pro with a 9.0, and the Ruby is one of the most spin-friendly paddles I've ever tested, so it gets a 9.5. Keep in mind, these scores are based off of how these paddles perform for every type of spin shot, so even though the X3 Pro has perhaps a little more top-end spin than the Ruby, it suffers a lot in other areas, so it scores quite a bit lower. These are all paddles I like to call new era thermoform paddles because they all have an adaptive quality that makes them still rigid when you want to go for a power and spin shot, but then more plush when you're going for touch shots. The first paddle I tested that was capable of that was the Rhombus R1 Nova, but since then, it's these Kevlar paddles that have impressed me the most in that regard. Kevlar has this unique ability to pocket the ball a little more softly than carbon, but then still seems to shoot it out just as firmly as what we've come to expect from thermoform paddles. And once again, the Ruby is the most impressive one of the bunch. I think it may be because it's the only one that has a full Kevlar top sheet, but it provides the best feel for the ball and also has the most significant contrast between that rigidity when you want it and that softness when you need it. It's the paddle I was most confident with when I was going for dinks, resets, and drops, and because it has that hybrid shape, it's the one I most enjoyed going for deceptive shots with. Now the Proline Energy S also impressed me a lot with its adaptability, especially when I reviewed it back in November, but if I have to nitpick a small issue I have with it compared to the Ruby, it's that it's a little too muted for my taste. I'm not going to knock it too much for this because I know a lot of people like that muted feel, but for me, it's just a little too disconnected from the ball, which stops me from getting really dialed into the soft game. The X3 Pro has phenomenal feel. Very similar feel to what you'll have on the Ruby because it has that adaptive plushness and yet still a very responsive feel to it. The issue here is that the face itself is smaller than on other paddles and much smaller than on the Ruby, so it's not nearly as forgiving of a paddle. That small face means that unless you're super on top of your game, you won't feel as comfortable with it during long kitchen rallies. It is very punishing. Then you've got the extra weight, which means it's very stable when you're hitting hard or countering pace, but it also means that one little error in your touch shot will be exponentially magnified. The X3 Lite is kind of the odd one out of the bunch because it does feel quite a bit softer, kind of like non-thermoform paddles almost. Now yes, those paddles might be technically softer, but they're also a little mushy and have a more hollow, disconnected feel from the ball. So even though they might take away from the ball's energy a little bit, which is supposed to help in the soft game, I don't find them as good for control. Ranking the 4, I am going to put the X3 Lite in last again, but just barely. I'm going to give it an 8.1 and the Proline Energy S an 8.3. The X3 Pro I'm going to give an 8.6 and the Ruby is going to come out on top again with a nice round 9.0. What's pretty crazy about these paddles is that I just gave them 8s and 9s for control, but they're still not true control paddles. Because they're thermoformed, I would still say that their power is more outstanding than their control. Now the X3 Pro is one of the most ridiculously powerful paddles I've ever play tested, and that's in large part due to the high static and swing weight. The higher you go in weight, especially in swing weight, the higher you're pushing your ceiling for the amount of power your paddle can generate. With lower swing weights, you'll feel a cap on how hard you can hit because at some point, the paddle's just not going to have enough mass to back up your fast swing speed. With the X3 Pro, I never got to that point. Maybe if you have ridiculous fast twitch muscles, you can find the paddle's limit, but most normal humans will never feel a cap on the amount of power they can generate here. The Ruby is also very powerful. Like I said, it has the biggest contrast on that rigidity to plushness ratio, so it's very firm when you're hitting hard. Also, it's very impressive for pop at the net because it's so easy to flick the paddle, especially when you're comparing it to something like the X3 Pro. Obviously, because it's so heavy, you won't be able to hit those flicky types of volleys, but this is still a great paddle for net play because it's so stable, you can kind of just use your opponent's pace to finish points. The Proline Energy S is definitely more firm than it is soft. It's the one of the 4 that feels most like Gen 2 thermoform paddles, but it is still a little bit softer than those because of that muted feel. It didn't really blow me away in any one power area like the Ruby did on volleys and the X3 Pro did on ground strokes, but it's still a very solid performer. Now because the X3 Lite feels a bit more soft and traditional, you're not going to get the same top end power like you will on the other 3, but it's definitely no slouch. I actually really like the fact this paddle has that shorter face and longer handle because it feels a lot more whippy than paddles with a more traditional 5.5-inch handle. On the X3 Pro, that whippiness is kind of overpowered by the ridiculously high weight specs, but here you can really take advantage of it and crank that paddle face through contact to generate tons of power. Still, I am going to have to put it in last again. I'm going to give the X3 Lite an 8.3 for power. In third, it's going to be the Proline Energy S, but not far behind the Ruby. The Ruby is better for pop, and the Proline Energy S is better for power on ground strokes, but the Ruby has a little bit more of that wow factor, so I'm going to give it a 9.1 and the Proline Energy S a 9.0. The X3 Pro is easily first for power, which is kind of funny considering it has the thickest core, but I've never felt so much top end power. I'm giving it a 9.7. Before we wrap it up, I do just want to touch on maneuverability because it is so important, but you can also kind of look at these paddles and figure it out for yourself. The Ruby is by far the most maneuverable. The fact that it's shorter just means it's going to be a lot quicker through the air than anything that's 16.5 inches long. The X3 Lite is actually much more maneuverable than you would expect, again, because it has that longer handle, which means it's a little bit more aerodynamically optimized than, for example, the Proline Energy S. This one is technically 16.4 inches long, but it feels pretty much identical to a fully elongated paddle. Maybe a little quicker than average, but not much. Then you've got the X3 Pro. It's thick, it's extremely heavy, and it's elongated. It's about as slow as they come. Maybe not the heaviest paddle ever, but I really can't think of another one right now. It is a bit of a bummer, and it does mean you have to be a very high level player to justify swinging this paddle, but keep in mind that unique stability, power, and spin is really only achievable with those high weight specs. I have to give it a 5 for maneuverability, which is going to really hurt its overall score, but I'll show a rating with and without maneuverability, because if you have really quick reactions, you can definitely work around it. The Proline Energy S is going to be next, and I'm going to give it a solid 8. Then the X3 Lite gets an 8.7, and finally the Ruby comes in first with a 9.3. So when we add up all the scores, in fourth we have the X3 Pro with a total score of 32.3 and an average rating of 8.08. In third, we have the X3 Lite with 32.7 points, averaging out to 8.18. Then in second, we have the Proline Energy S with a total of 33.5 points, averaging out to 8.34. Then finally, the Ruby blows everyone out of the water with a total of 36.9 points for an average of 9.2. This adds up. The Ruby is truly a phenomenal pickleball paddle, one of the best I've tried, and seeing it score all 9s is logical because there's really no area where this paddle is bad. In fact, it's pretty much excellent everywhere. Then you look at the X3 Pro, and while it pains me to see it in fourth, objectively, that's where it's got to go because that maneuverability makes it such a punishing paddle that's really only going to work in the hands of very few players. When you take out maneuverability, though, it moves up significantly to second place. It averages out to 9.1. The X3 Lite moves down a little bit to 8.07. The Proline Energy S also moves up to 8.5, and the Ruby stays at 9.2. That's just it. This is a phenomenal paddle if you can swing it well. So I think that's the perfect way to summarize which Kevlar paddle is the best. The Ruby is without question the best Kevlar paddle I've tried. The Proline Energy S is great, but not quite up there with the Ruby. The X3 Lite is also good, but does have some room for improvement. And then the X3 Pro is the absolute wild card that's going to be completely useless for some players and then an absolute weapon for others. With that said, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. And remember that if you want to demo any of these paddles, you can come visit us in store or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.